Welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. The New York Times has this. India is saying that it will keep purchasing cheap oil from Russia despite a threat of penalties from President Trump. The Times says that the move reflects increasing frustration surrounding the U.S.-India relationship, a relationship that was once much praised, but has been souring rapidly. Trump recently said he would impose an unspecified penalty on India if they didn't cut their imports of Russian oil. Host of the Strap podcast, Hal Kempfer, is still here. We'll get to the Russian piece of this in a moment, Hal. Let's focus on the U.S.-India relationship first. Why is a healthy U.S.-India relationship important? Maybe the better question is, why is a turbulent relationship not ideal?
Well, it's not ideal because it's kind of a counter, if you will, to China. Also, it's part of what's called the Quad, which is an informal group that's become more and more formalized over time, where India is a linchpin, and then you have Japan and Australia with the U.S. and doing joint military exercises, a lot of interaction with that. So we've been trying to basically make India our lead ally, if you will. I don't know if it's going to become more lead than, say, Australia, but a major ally that we can rely upon in not just South Asia and Asia, but also in the Indian Ocean and everything that connects to. So it's been a relationship we've been working on for a number of years. However, if you go back historically, India has always had kind of a third way of doing things. And during the Cold War, they would say, we have our third way. We're neither communist, we're neither fully capitalist. We do what we do. And they used to buy weaponry from the Soviet Union. And they maintain very cordial relationships with the Soviet Union, which we found very unsettling. We had a closer relationship with Pakistan during the Cold War, and that has been reassessing itself, shifting around. Pakistan has aligned itself closer with China. We aligned ourselves very closely with Modi's India, and it seemed like everything was moving pretty close up until a few months ago, and then all these trade issues popped up, and now we're seeing this more distant relationship starting to emerge.
So one thing as we take a live look at the White House, 512 in the nation's capital, I got to say this, India is the most populated country on the planet, 1.4 billion people. Is there an argument to be made, Hal, that the word of the White House shouldn't decide how they get energy to their people? Is that India's perspective?
Well, India's perspective is that they don't want to be bullied by the U.S. And a lot of this is with Modi internal to India. Right now, they've got trade negotiations with the U.S. One of the things we're really pushing hard on is we're saying, look, you can't keep protecting all your agricultural goods. Now, 40% of the population works in agriculture, very different from here. And they've always had these massive barriers protecting agricultural production, agricultural products, and blocking agricultural imports into India. The U.S., we're a major ag power in the world scene, and we want to be able to export there. This is causing huge political turmoil within India. And I think what you're seeing is Modi is kind of lashing back, not directly on the ag issue, but he's saying this on oil. The interesting thing on oil, though, is most of the oil companies there had already stopped buying more Russian oil. They'd kind of put a moratorium on that. There's even one firm, which is about half Russian owned, where they kicked out the Russian CEO or the Russian picked CEO, I should say. And there have been cases where tankers coming from Russia with oil, literally a few days ago, turned around and went the other direction because they weren't going to offload their oil in India. That would indicate one thing. But now we're seeing this political statement, which says we're not going to be bullied in terms of buying Russian oil. We get our sources of oil from anywhere else. I think they're a little concerned, though, that if they don't get Russian oil, then they're really dependent on the Middle East, primarily Saudi Arabia, and dependent on the U.S. For oil. And I think they've been kind of working through, well, what does that do for us strategically speaking? Are we going to make ourselves more vulnerable by doing that? So I think they're just taking a kind of a third way in the Indian tradition, if you will.
Can you expand on the amount of people that still buy oil from Russia? Do a lot of countries still buy oil from Russia?
Some. The two biggest countries that buy oil are China and India, by far. And to give you an idea of how much oil India is buying, before the war in Ukraine, India imported about less than 1% of its oil from Russia. Now it imports about 40%. Okay, that's a lot of oil. And they've been buying that oil at a discount because Russian oil is kind of cheap on the global market. It's heavily sanctioned, obviously, but it's very cheap on the global market. So they get it at a discount, which actually kind of subsidizes their industry and everything else because they're able to buy oil cheap. So that's for the gain that they get out of that. Now, here's the tough part: is that coming up on August 8th, if there isn't some sort of agreement in Ukraine, we may impose secondary tariffs on countries that import Russian oil. According to President Trump, that could be a 100% tariff on what they export. That would have enormous implications in India, enormous implications in China. But politically speaking, that also comes across as very much as a threat or bullying to India. And I think what you're seeing is basically some lashing back at this because they don't like to be bullied.
What avenues does the U.S. have to punish India if they choose to? Are we likely looking at higher tariffs? Is that what it's going to be?
Probably right now, I would say higher tariffs. And, I thought it was kind of interesting that we suddenly decided to impose 35% tariffs on India. And that was in part to, I think, to pressure Indians to come to some sort of trade agreement that we would find acceptable. And so they put that 35%. Well, that caused a lot of pressure with India, and it is kind of the rule of second and third order effects. That India is the largest democracy in the world, and like all democracies, there's a lot of different opinions that run around in India, and they tend to be very independent. That's kind of their history since they've been an independent country. They have very independent thinking within India, and I don't think they like to be pressured by a foreign power. And, originally you would have said it would have been Britain way back when. Now it's the U.S., and I think to them they feel like the U.S. is pressuring them to accept whatever deal that we want to put out there. But also they may interpret that, I'm sure with some, they say they're we're pressuring India to be, fall into the U.S. orbit, if you will. And so there is some pushback there. And I also should mention one other thing. You may have noticed that they had a little battle a while back, not too long ago, and a lot of fierce stuff. We were talking about the threat of maybe it expanding into nuclear war. That's a big deal. All right. Anyway, with all that said, after that was done, as I understand it, if I got the timing right, the head of India's military actually visited the White House, or not India, I'm sorry, Pakistan's military visited the White House, which really irritated the Indians to no end. That here you have this Pakistani military chief, if you will, sitting in the White House meeting with the president after what's just happened. You can imagine how that has caused ripples in the political pond, if you will, within India that Modi has to deal with.
This is a tricky situation in the political pond. What's the path of least resistance going forward? How do we think this is going to end? Is India simply going to keep buying Russian oil? Is some other agreement going to be made with the White House? How does it feel?
I think we're going to have to figure out some deal where they get oil for a really good price and certainly more than enough to keep them going. I think we've probably done enough with the stick. We need to figure out some carrot approach to incentivize them to do this. And I think there's a lot of carrots out there that we have. We just probably haven't explored everything that we can do to help them out. But I think we're also being a little cautious, because India does at times move the other direction. And they recently did that with their decision on an aircraft purchase, which was very disappointing to the U.S. Don't think that isn't part of the mix of why we're frustrated with India, is because they have not separated themselves from Russian weapons. The problem is if they're buying Russian weapons, then they get Russian influence and Russian presence all at the same time, which makes it very difficult for us to work with them on a military side if there's a bunch of Russians keeping their military going, all right, and from a maintenance side, technical support, things like that. So there's just a lot of factors and considerations that go into this.
How important is India buying Russian oil to the Russian economy? How big of a piece of the pie is it there?
Huge. It's enormous. And if they were to lose that Indian purchase of oil, that would cause a massive hit on their foreign revenues, which would eventually cause them to have to rethink how much they can put into the war with Ukraine. If we could achieve the same thing with China, I think that's a much more difficult objective to achieve, if you will. But if we could cut off Russian oil exports to India and China, we have literally cut off the primary source of foreign revenue going to Russia. And at that point, Putin is really stuck. He just will not be able to sustain the war against Ukraine for too much longer.